In the shadowy halls of medieval power, where alliances were sealed in blood and secrets could cost an entire kingdom, a story unfolded that shook even an age accustomed to barbarity. A child, barely 12 years old, elevated to the Senate as if he were just another piece in his father's chess game. But what should have been a dynastic triumph soon became the most brutal tragedy of his life. Because the ambition of Theodore of Montferrat knew no bounds, and his own son, Octavius, would be the highest price ever paid for power. What happened next not only defied all notions of authority and family but also unleashed an unexpected transformation, one that would place nobles, peasants, and entire kingdoms in check. This story contains acts of abuse of power and institutional violence. There will be no graphic details, but what you are about to hear is harsh and real. Stay until the end, because what began as an act of cruelty would become a lesson in resistance that still resonates centuries later. The year was 1387. Northern Italy was abhorred in flames, duchies, marquisates, and merchant republics fought over every inch of land as if it were gold. Alliances were forged at dawn and betrayed by nightfall. No one was safe from instability. Montferrat, a small but strategic marquisate, was trapped between powers that seemed like giants, the Duchy of Milan, the House of Savoy, and the city-state struggling to maintain their influence. For nobles, power was not an inheritance, it was a daily war. And in that war, children became useful pieces. Placing a boy in a seat of power was a common move, it guaranteed obedient votes and, above all, reinforced the image of dynastic continuity. The Senate of Montferrat, in theory a deliberative body, was in reality a showcase controlled by the most influential families. What was decided there had already been arranged in private chambers, far from the people's gaze. It was in this stage of constant wars, silent intrigues, and a Senate turned into theater, that young Octavius of Montferrat was thrown into the game, never imagining that, for his own father, he would not be a son, but the most expendable piece on the board. Octavius of Montferrat was born in the castle of Castrated, in the heart of the marquisate. From an early age, his life was marked by a paradox: he was a child, but he never knew childhood. At 5 he was already studying Latin, diplomacy, and the arts of war. At 8, he listened to councils of state as if he were an adult. And by 10, he accompanied his father to negotiations that would decide the peace or war of an entire region. Chroniclers of the time described him as a boy with clear eyes and precocious intelligence, able to grasp the dilemmas of government with a maturity that unsettled even the most experienced diplomats. Facing him stood his father, Theodore I, a feared, shrewd, and profoundly distrustful marquis. For him, power was synonymous with absolute control, and obedience was not a virtue, but an obligation. That contrast would be fatal: a son with a critical mind, and a father determined to crush it in the name of his lineage's stability. At 12 years old, Octavius was named senator of the realm. The ceremony in Castrated Cathedral was solemn: purple garments embroidered in gold, oaths before nobles and clerics, and a child transformed into a symbol of dynastic future. To many, it seemed only a political gesture, but inside that boy was more than obedience. For months, Octavius fulfilled the role designed by his father. He attended every session, remained silent, and voted exactly as ordered. He was the perfect piece in Theodore's chessboard. But soon, something began to change. Octavius started to understand the true weight of the decisions made in that hall. He saw how new taxes ruined peasants and merchants, and how the people's voice never reached those marble tables. In February 1388, the spark ignited. The Senate debated a military campaign against the Duchy of Savoy, financed with more taxes. Against his father's orders, Octavius rose from his seat. With a firm voice, he denounced that such burdens would impoverish the people to the point of revolt. Silence fell over the hall. Senators hardened by intrigue stared in disbelief. A child had dared defy the marquis in front of everyone. Theodore, red with fury, forced him to sit. But from that moment on, the father stopped seeing his son as an obedient heir, and began to see him as a threat. After that speech in the Senate, the relationship between Octavius and Theodore was never the same. What had been a simple disagreement became a silent war inside their own castle. The Marquis, unable to tolerate a dissenting voice within his own blood, decided to tighten control over his son. He changed his tutors. The humanists who had nurtured Octavius's critical thinking were replaced by rigid masters who repeated a single lesson: obey. He forbade him from meeting other young nobles, fearing his rebelliousness would spread. And he confined him to an ever narrower circle, watched, isolated, suffocated. But Theodoro made a mistake. He believed that silence meant submission. Octavius, far from breaking, found new ways to resist. He secretly read philosophical texts in Latin, built a clandestine network of contacts among lesser nobles, and little by little began to articulate ideas that questioned his father's absolute authority. The Marquis thought he had extinguished a spark. But what he had really done was ignite a fire that would soon burn beyond his control. In a chamber filled with maps and burning candles, the most powerful men of the Marquisate debated how to withstand the pressure from the Duchy of Milan. Everyone expected blind obedience from the young senator. But Octavius, at barely 13 years old, made a decision no one could have imagined. Convinced that the peasants would be the true victims of another war, he leaked information to enemy envoys, hoping that in return they would respect the rights of the people. When Theodoro I discovered the act, his world shattered. For a marquis obsessed with control, this was not a childish mistake, nor an excess of naivety. It was treason. And worst of all, treason born of his own blood. The council chamber turned into a field of unbearable tension. The nobles whispered alternatives. Send him to a monastery. Banish him, make him disappear. Lock him away until he learns. But Theodoro did not listen. His eyes remained fixed, cold, staring into the void. In his mind, a dark, calculated, merciless idea was taking shape. If his son could defy him, he could also become a symbol of opposition. And a symbol was more dangerous than any army. So he made a decision impossible to reverse, to uproot everything that made Octavius an heir, a man, a potential rival. That night, in the silence of the castle, the fate of the young senator was sealed. A fate that surpassed even the brutalities accepted in the Middle Ages, and that would forever change the history of Montferrat. After that night, Octavius vanished from the world. Officially, the Marquis announced that his son had fallen gravely ill and needed rest. But with every public event he missed, doubts grew. How could it be that such a promising young senator showed no signs of recovery? The lesser nobles, who had seen in Octavius a different voice within the Senate, began to worry. Some requested audiences to visit him, but all were rejected with vague excuses: he has a fever, he is not receiving visitors. Within the castle walls, the servants whispered what no one dared say aloud, that the boy was no longer the same, that he had been transformed, that he had been silenced in an irreversible way. The church also began to move its pieces. The Bishop of Castrated, disturbed by the rumors, requested a private meeting with the Marquis. He knew that something dark was being concealed behind that convenient illness. Meanwhile, in the town squares, common folk whispered in outrage. For them, Octavius was not a traitor, he was the boy who in the Senate had defended the poor against higher taxes. His absence was seen as punishment for speaking the truth. The prayers for the young man's recovery soon turned into protests disguised as prayers. Under the smoke of candles and the murmurs of collective devotion, a dangerous sentiment was taking root, the idea that even the absolute power of a marquis could be questioned. While the outside world swirled with rumors, inside the castle Octavius waged his own silent war. Stripped of his identity, isolated from public life, and watched day and night, anyone else would have been expected to resign. But Octavius chose another path: invisible resistance. He learned to obey in appearance, while in his mind he clung to the memory of his days as a senator. He recreated political debates, imagined alternative solutions, and little by little cultivated a thought more mature and strategic than ever before. In secret, he began to write. With improvised ink, recycled paper, and quills salvaged from the courtyards, he filled pages with political reflections, plans for reform, and accounts of what he saw and heard in the corridors. Because his confinement had an unexpected effect, it kept him close to the Marquis. Theodoro, convinced his son was neutralized, spoke of confidential matters in his presence. Without realizing it, he was gifting Octavius valuable information about the looming crisis. Moreover, the young man maintained ties with the castle's servants. They, who had always seen in him respect and humanity, now became his eyes and ears in the outside world. Through them, he learned of the growing unrest in the villages and the diplomatic pressure weighing on his father. Octavius had no weapons and no army. But he had discovered something far more powerful, that true resistance could begin in the mind, and that even in silence he could prepare the ground for a different future. The winter of 1389 arrived like an unrelenting storm, and not just in the weather. From the borders of the Marquisate, alarming news set off every alarm. Milan and Savoy had joined forces in a coordinated invasion. Meanwhile, within the villages, the peasants, ruined by years of excessive taxation, rose in rebellion, burning granaries and executing tax collectors. For the first time in decades, Teodoro I was overwhelmed. The Marquis, who had always ruled with cold calculation, now wandered through his halls in despair. His advisors contradicted each other: negotiate, flee, crush with blood and fire. No option seemed capable of saving him. On those nights, Octavio observed his father like never before, the feared man, reduced to a leader who no longer knew what to do. Every gesture of frustration, every stifled sigh, confirmed what he had suspected in his secret writings: the Marquisate was on the brink of the abyss. And in that crack of weakness, Octavio saw his opportunity. Because what his father could never have imagined, was that the son he had tried to silence would be the only one capable of saving him. One freezing night, the Marquis collapsed into his chair. The enemy army was only 2 days' march from the castle, and the villages were ablaze in rebellion. For the first time, Teodoro I seemed defeated before even fighting the battle. Then, the unthinkable happened. Octavio, the silenced son, the boy reduced to a shadow, raised his voice. But not as a victim, rather, as an advisor. "Father," he said firmly, "I have been analyzing this crisis for weeks. And there is a way out." Teodoro looked at him with fury. How dare he? Yet in his gaze there was also a glimmer of something new: need. For hours, Octavio unfolded a plan that surpassed any calculation of the advisors. He proposed inviting the enemies to the table, not as invaders, but as business partners. The Marquisate controlled key routes to the Mediterranean, and that was the true ambition of Milan and Savoy. At the same time, he suggested unprecedented fiscal reforms, relieving the peasants to restore their ability to produce, and in doing so, multiply the crown's revenues in the long term. It was a bold, radical strategy, unthinkable in an era accustomed to war and repression. But for the first time in months, Teodoro heard something that seemed like hope. That night, the son his father had tried to destroy became the only voice capable of saving the kingdom. Octavio's plan began to take shape, but not everyone was willing to accept it. In council sessions, the most conservative nobles erupted in shouts. Betrayal. Trading with those who wanted to invade us. Lowering taxes for insolent peasants. That will destroy the feudal order. To them, the young senators' proposals were political heresy. They meant giving up privileges they had defended for generations. But Octavio, far from being intimidated, displayed a surprising skill. He knew every ambition, every fear, every weak point of the men who challenged him. And one by one, he began to dismantle them. To the Count of Castellamont, his fiercest opponent, he revealed a secret that left him speechless: his lands hid high-quality salt mines. With the new trade routes opened, that salt could multiply his wealth like never before. Faced with the possibility of losing everything, or gaining more than he had ever dreamed, the Count changed sides. And his example dragged others along. Thus, little by little, Octavio turned the council chamber into his own chessboard. Not with swords or shouts, but with cunning, vision, and a capacity for persuasion that no one expected from that young man marked by tragedy. The boy who had been silenced now forced the most powerful men of the Marquisate to listen to every word he spoke. What many called madness, soon became a political miracle. The agreements with Milan and Savoy not only avoided war, they turned former enemies into business partners interested in the stability of the Marquisate. Suddenly, the routes to the Mediterranean were filled with caravans and goods that multiplied the kingdom's wealth. At the same time, the fiscal reforms began to bear fruit. The peasants, freed from the unbearable burden of taxes, regained their ability to produce. Harvests increased, markets flourished, and with them, the crown's revenues grew more than ever. But the deepest change was not economic, but social. For the first time, nobles, merchants, and peasants shared a common space, the consultative assemblies promoted by Octavius. There, voices that had long been ignored could finally be heard, and their problems found swift and fair solutions. The Marquisate, once on the brink of collapse, was reborn as a territory more prosperous, stable, and united than ever before. And at the center of it all stood him, the young man who, after being stripped of everything, had transformed his pain into the strength capable of reshaping the destiny of his people. The young man who had been humiliated and silenced had now become something more than a political leader. Octavius learned to turn his tragedy into a unique virtue, empathy. Unlike other nobles, he knew firsthand what it meant to lose everything, and that experience made him a different kind of ruler. When he visited villages, he did not arrive with escorts to impose his authority, but to listen. He would stop to speak with elders, widows, and peasants barely able to survive, and he sought concrete solutions for each one. That way of governing not only surprised people but also inspired them. Very soon, his image ceased to be that of a punished son and became a symbol of hope for thousands. Octavius also began to write with discipline. From his pages emerged the treatises of Montferrat, documents in which he recorded his ideas about justice, reconciliation, and the true purpose of power. Texts that, centuries later, would be read as an early seed of modern ideals of human rights and democracy. Thus, the child torn away from public life, marked by his father's cruelty, became something he never would have imagined, a beacon for his own time and for the future. Octavius of Montferrat died young, at 26. But his funeral was not that of just another noble. Peasants, artisans, clerics, and even foreign ambassadors came together to honor him. Everyone knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. His life, scarred by paternal cruelty, was transformed into a legacy of justice and reconciliation. His writings and his actions sowed ideas that, centuries later, would inspire new forms of government and human dignity. The story of Octavius reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, a steadfast spirit can turn pain into strength and abuse into hope. And now the question remains for you. What would you do with the power you have, no matter how small it may seem, to protect the most vulnerable? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Because on this channel, we continue discovering how the past can shed light on our present.